Today I'm going to talk about a few different things. Before we start, I just wanted to ask you a question and put a hand up so I at least can address the majority of people in the audience. Who here are actual farmers, that's graziers or whatever? Okay. Who here are interested in ecological, environmental? That's probably all of you. It's probably a silly question. I sometimes ask questions about, well, is anyone here growing, any of the farmers here growing any crops, even for stock food or anything like that? Yeah, a few, okay. It's interesting, I usually at the bigger workshops I do ask questions about who here are growing crops but don't rear livestock, and no one ever puts their hand up. The croppers sort of don't like coming to days where they're wanting to learn about environmental and ecological stuff. But that's okay. Another question I often ask is, who here wants to reduce their pesticides and fertilisers and that, when everyone puts their hand up for that. So it's a really good indication of the way things are wanting to go, people are wanting to go on the land. And I talk a lot about ecosystems and ecology, and farmers often get a lesson in ecology by stealth. So anyway, restoring a farm ecosystem, which is vitally important we can never fix our farms, and we will never fix this planet of ours if we don't restore ecosystems. And our farm is an ecosystem, or at least it should be. Unfortunately, most of them aren't ecosystems anymore. So this is just a little bit on what I do at home, and I haven't got a lot on this, but myself and my son Nick is on the place. There's a couple of thousand acres there. I'm in central tableland, sort of north of Mudgee, granite soils. Some of it's a bit similar to what we've got around these areas. Now, just a little bit on farm layout, but because we have a grazing rotation or graze holistically, there's quite a lot of paddocks now. There's 70 odd paddocks. But down here is probably more important. What I've done is planted 1,500 all local species of trees over the property, and all the remnant areas have been fenced. That's just a remnant area, that photo there. And trees are an important part of the story, but not the only part. A lot of things like grasslands have been overlooked. Vital for agriculture, but it's also vital for restoring our whole ecosystem as well as our farm ecosystems. On the practical side of the farm, basically we run merino sheep and have run for merino sheep for about 150 years. Not me personally. Great-grandparents settled in the 1860s. So 4,000 merino sheep, and they started with merino sheep too, so I haven't really learnt much at all. Still running merino sheep. Run cattle, trade in cattle. And the crops we sow, about a quarter of the property, about 500 acres, are all pasture cropped. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but not a lot today. Run a merino stud, and also sell working dogs, kelpies all over the world. But one of the interesting things, because the property now is a restored native grassland, it's given us the opportunity to harvest a lot of native grassland. We harvest up to 2 tonne a year, between 1 and 2 tonne of seed, native seed a year. And that's used for rehabilitation work, but also, I won't go into it now, but there's a lot of interest in Sydney University and with the Aboriginal Gamilaroi people at Narrabri working with restoring or relearning the Aboriginal uses of a lot of the seed that they had for food source, which is a really very exciting program. Anyway, what happened to my family is that it's an interesting journey, and the reason I speak about it is that my family, including myself, totally stuffed up along the way. as almost everyone did. Everyone into the European, except for everyone into the country, except for our Aboriginal people, were immigrants into this country. So we didn't really know, especially in that era, really how to farm Australia at all, how to manage the country. Our Aboriginal people did, but we didn't take any notice of them, of course, which is a real shame. Now, great-grandparents, which I've sort of have covered a little bit, I better not tell too many stories, I'll be here all day. But started with merino sheep and started growing crops in the 1860s. My great-grandfather then was sowing crops, but just digging it with a hoe, almost like a garden. The observant amongst you will notice that he's only got one leg, and I like to tell people that it's not a genetic defect. It was he fell off a wagon and got run over and had to have his leg amputated. And I know I shouldn't go too far into this, but I will. You see old Granny's up there. Amazing lady, my great-grandmother. She ran the farm because it's fairly difficult to run a farm, especially in the 1880s, with one leg. She ran the farm, but she ran the farm in a different way. And she ran the farm as a woman would, and of course, she's female. And women are totally different. In that women are nurturers. They nurture the animals, to nurture the land, nurture everything. And one of the great things about it, she had a great influence on her firstborn grandson, who happened to be my father, and passed a lot of that knowledge about nurturing on to her firstborn grandson. So what I'm getting at here, to cut the story a bit shorter, is we need more women in agriculture. We need more women like ladies like her. We need women in all forms of agriculture, whether it's farming itself or advisory work, agronomy work. We need more women in agriculture, because I think that's the fastest way we'll get change of anything. Because you women approach things differently. Us blokes, me being one, we just want to go out there and kill things. And we kill things with ploughs, bulldozers and pesticides. So that needs to change. And I think that the fastest way is for more women to be involved in agriculture. When I started to say that about 10 or 15 years ago, I'd always get some old cranky bugger up the back want to chuck rocks at me. It doesn't seem to happen quite as much anymore, although I think I just lost half the audience. So anyway, I better move on here. I shouldn't move around. I get into trouble with the camera on here. So the original grasslands that they had, their great-grandparents had well over 200 species. We don't know for sure, but 200 to 300 species in the grasslands. Huge. I mean, the diversity was huge. These grasslands were described as some of the best in the world in Australia. The Australian grasslands were described by the Europeans at the time by some of the best in the world. So they were magnificent grasslands. Also, we get told how poor our soil is. It wasn't always, because these grasslands not only nurtured everything else, but they nurtured the soil. The only way we can fix soil is growing plants. That's what built soil in the first place. So our soils under these grasslands were absolutely magnificent soils as well. So industrial agriculture, that's the best part of the talk. The industrial agriculture started in the 1930s. My father started with horse teams, but then quickly moved to industrial agriculture and tractors and that. And it was very profitable in the 1930s. He did really well growing wheat in the 1930s, but huge damage. That's actually a photo that my mother took of a wedge-tailed eagle strung on a fence, which is bad enough in itself. But that's why I haven't got that's not the reason I have the photo there. There's a gully already behind that photo, and it's only 5 years after that wheat crop was grown. So the ploughing and wheat growing did serious damage very early. And he grew these wheat crops without fertiliser or anything. Well, there was no pesticides in the era, but he grew them without fertiliser as well. But huge damage very quickly. And it was a great source of embarrassment to my father with these big, they ended up 3 metres deep, those gullies. And so he filled them and restored the property. So, industrial agriculture was adopted from the 1950s to the 1970s, like he changed, my father changed. It was also on annual introduced pastures, the sub-clover or the sub-super phase that many of us know about. Ploughing, cultivating, which was the only way you could do it those times. But fertiliser and pesticides, a lot of fertiliser and some pesticides used early days. This is in the 1960s and 70s. It was very productive in that era. It's okay for us to be critical of it now, but it did work very well in that era from a production point of view. And now I got into the Act in the 1970s, continuing the destruction of the property. Me with my dog up there, and the brother and I were spraying DDT to kill red-legged earth mites also. So I didn't help very much either. If I'd have got a bigger plough, I'd have even created more destruction. That form of agriculture did serious damage to the property, ecological damage to the property, and no one realised at the time that it was ecological damage. And we do need to realise that all of the problems in agriculture are not actually agricultural ones, they're ecological problems. And we should fix them and can fix them in an ecological manner. And they're very easy to fix, actually. There isn't any problem fixing this and restoring this. But interestingly, those high input methods were also costing, well, my father in particular, $80,000, this is on today's figures, every year. So it was an expensive thing to maintain, all that fertiliser and pesticides. It started to crash in the 1970s. Ecologically, it did start to crash quite early on the property at home. And that's because my father was very innovative and he adopted all the best science at the time very, very early. This was the best science of the day. And so we ran into problems on the property earlier than most because of that. So fertiliser costs started to become too high. The soil was really had lost structure and became acidic. Salinity problems, trees dying, and we were going broke. Interestingly, the advice at the time was to put more fertiliser on. And the advice now is still the bloody same, put more fertiliser on. Nothing much has really changed. So how and why did I change? So as I said then, we were running into some problems in the 1970s, but this is what happened in 1979. We had a major bushfire, a serious, very much like the ones last year, that type of fire. But, and it was like an atomic bomb going off on the place. We had 3,000 sheep killed, all the buildings were destroyed, all the fencing was gone, and we were just broke. Just went from going sort of okay to instant break almost overnight. So what I did was look for, I got burnt in as well, so I had plenty of time in hospital to think about things. And so I was trying to work out how we could survive just financially. Couldn't afford all the fertiliser and pesticides and all those inputs anymore. And so I started to look at low input agriculture. And in my case, that low input agriculture had to be different to low input agriculture. We had no money, it had to be no input agriculture. Couldn't afford anything anyway. So we stopped using fertiliser and pesticides, focused on ground cover. We know about ground cover. Costa's gardening show tells us every Sunday that we need to put mulch on our gardens. We need to do that in our paddocks and in agriculture. So I focused on ground cover. I adopted holistic planned grazing and pasture cropping in 1993 and combined them later in 1995. But what I really did was focused on restoring the property to a grassland, native grassland. There was no great philosophy behind it other than I knew the native grasses didn't need fertiliser at the time. You got to remember when it was and the knowledge that we had in those times. No one was thinking about ecological reasons for doing things. So how did I restore the grasslands? A very important part of this is grazing management. So the way we graze and the way we've grazed for thousands of years doesn't work. And it's interesting, agriculture started around in Mesopotamia over 10,000 years ago. And they basically created the desert there. A lot of that was done by goats, and so the poor old goat gets blamed, but it's the human managing the goat that's the problem. We are no better in this country. If we're not careful, we'll turn this country into a desert as well. So the way we graze now kills grasslands, destroys the soil ecosystem and destroys the farm ecosystem. But it's not really grazing that's the problem. It's not giving the plants enough time to recover from the grazing event that kills the plants. So it's not the animal that's the problem, it's the human managing the animal that's the problem. And it is quite simple. That form of grazing is really quite simple. Originally developed by a fellow called Colin Seis, Rhodesian, who mimicked understood how the African herds, huge herds of millions of animals, rotated around the areas and didn't come back till 6 months later. So, giving you enough information there in about 2 minutes to be very dangerous to yourself. This is what we do at home. 2 mobs of sheep mainly. It does change a bit. Of 2,500 adult sheep, mostly used, not all used now. Around about 1,500 hoggets are under 1 year old. When we've got cattle, they're included with the sheep. And I look at 4 months before they get back again in that rotation. So that's just a photo of a mob of ewes and lambs. There's probably close to 5,000 sheep there. Can't fit them all in the photo. Like they're ewes with their lambs, about ready to be weaned. But it's interesting, they're very easy to handle in large mobs like that. Surprising. Yep.
Before you rotate the livestock, is there a minimum height in the grass that you're hoping to achieve?
There isn't a minimum height. It can be difficult to quantify it. You can graze. It's related more to recovery time. You can graze it quite short if you want. The main thing there is don't create bare ground. You can graze it quite hard, but if you graze it harder, then you've got to give it a longer time to recover. And that's really the key to that. Yeah. That method of grazing definitely will encourage perennial grassland species. It will discourage annual weeds and it will help restore the soil ecosystem and the farm ecosystem. So that's part of. And also remember, I'm going to talk about the things I do on my place here. And there's other ways of doing this. Like there's some wonderful principles in permaculture, biodynamics, the work that Peter Andrew's done on his rivers. There's a lot of good stuff we can use to regenerate our farms. And the more of those types of methods we put together at the same time on a property, the better. So don't get stuck on any one thing here, but there's a lot of ways we can do this. The other way that I developed a different way of sowing crops. Now we've sown crops for Mesopotamian time for 10,000 years. And for 10,000 years we've killed everything to get that plant to grow. This really is the first change in cropping for 10,000 years, pasture cropping is. So the way crops are grown, again, using ploughs and excessive use of herbicides also kills grassland, destroys the soil ecosystem and destroys the farm ecosystem. The two main things that we do are very destructive and it's created problems all over the planet. So, this is the best slide I've got, most important one. In 1993, a good mate of mine and neighbour, Darryl Clough, Cloughie was actually a land care coordinator at the time as well as owning a farm. I better not tell this story for too long too, I'll be running out of time. But we used to have a few beers in the evening and discuss the problems of the world. Well, one evening we were talking about the problems with the way we were growing crops. So we, at about midnight, after about 10 or 12 beers, we come up with this absolute lunatic idea of why are we killing the grass? Why are we were both zero tilling or direct drilling, but we were using high rates of Roundup and everything else we could throw at it to kill this native grass because we thought it was affecting the crop. So this idea of pasture cropping came out of that. And just the really broad principle of it really quickly is majority of our native grasses are summer growers, not all of them, but a big majority are. And those summer growing grasses go dormant in the winter. They go to sleep for the winter, which is when we grow most of our crops. So why are we killing these plants when they've gone to sleep for the winter anyway? So we started to drill crops into grassland when they were dormant, and it worked straight away. So pasture cropping now is adopted all around the world, but it really isn't any great philosophy. It's just two blokes drunk on the grog is where it came from. And people think it's, no, okay. But it is more than sowing into grass. It's actually perennial cover cropping. We're hearing more and more about cover cropping, and I work with a lot of American scientists and farmers. Well, we're sharing ideas mostly, and a lot of adoption now in the US of pasture cropping, as well as the cover cropping that the croppers here really should take on board. Cover cropping as a general rule. So, but pasture cropping is different to cover cropping in that we work with perennial species. Okay, so pasture cropping does produce good crops for grain and or grazing. It will restore grasslands, which is one of the really interesting things of it, by stimulating perennial grass species to germinate from seed that's in the soil. Some of this seed must have sat there for 50 or 60 or even more years, just sitting there in a dormant state. And the fact the crop itself growing stimulated the soil ecosystem, which then stimulated the seed to germinate. It sat there for that long, and we just created an environment for it so it was happy to germinate and grow in. Anyway, so, yep.
Can I ask you what type of native grasses you have?
There's about 60 species there now, but there's things like red grass, which grows pretty well everywhere, and is a lower successional grass. But there's things like warrego summer grass, which is a very high quality grass, green summer grass, cotton panic, microlina, which just grow around these areas here, wallaby grasses. Yeah, so there's a lot of diversity now in it.
So you don't upset any of those by doing this?
No, you don't kill any of those. Yeah, you can suppress them. It's not necessarily about not using no herbicide or little bit of ground disturbance, but it's about doing it a lot more carefully and more selectively. If we are still going to use a herbicide, and at some point in time, if you've got a paddock full of weeds, and I better not talk too much on it, you try to grow a crop into it, it's going to fail if it's a paddock full of weeds. So you've got to do something about that. If this is in the practical sense of farming. But there's methods that we use and I've developed over the years just to tweak it and get it to work in a practical sense. But we'll also restore the farm and the soil. So we're zero tilling into a dormant grassland. Really, is what we're doing. The zero tilling technology that's been out there for a long time. I didn't invent that. And it's adopted in many places now. So we're not ploughing at all. So just very quickly, a run of photos showing that. That's a native grassland. That's mostly warrego summer grass in there. And we harvest these as well. So there, and then what we're doing is using large mobs of sheep, and so we're creating mulch. And by the way, that mulch is thick, but not as thick as it looks. There's no one standing under the hat, so it's so if you've got, it reminds you of Costa's garden, doesn't it? because if you've got that much mulch, you don't get weeds to grow, you don't need to use herbicide. And that's partly how it works. And that's the cover, perennial cover in the cover cropping.
How do you sow into that depth of mulch?
It can be tricky. Now with zero-till, a lot of people are tending to move towards discs. I've got a disc opener in front of a tine and a point, which you can still get through it. Also, it's not, all those are anchored to the ground, so they don't actually pull out. So it's not as difficult as you'd think. It's not like wheat stubble, which will pull out as you're sowing. That's just as it's progressing. Emerging crop. When they're starting to grow, it's interesting, the crop looks that untidy. You don't show them to your bank manager when they're at that stage because they look, how the bloody hell is this thing going to end up a crop? Because all these are growing up, all the crop is growing up through this dry grass. But by the middle of the year, they look like that, look like a normal crop. Because they've got up above the grass. The grass is starting to break down as well. Then we get that. So this is just I've got a couple of different ways of doing this here. That's October, and that's harvesting. All the green in there is all native grasses just emerging because they don't. The summer grasses don't germinate in most, or don't start to grow again until about October or November, and the crop itself shades them and slows their growth down. So the crop itself actually suppresses those grasses for a while, which allows grain to be harvested.
Well, if you didn't go and harvest the grass there, how would you manage it? In terms of your livestock, how would you put the livestock into graze?
Yes.
If you didn't go and harvest it?
Could you still harvest it?
No, so say you weren't harvesting.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And all you're worried about is the native grasses coming
Yep.
through. How
Yep.
would you manage that?
Okay. What our next slides will probably mention that, but it's not a problem. You can graze these crops like a normal crop. When they're starting to emerge, you tend to look after them a little bit and get them up. At home, what we normally do is leave them until about January, February before they're grazed, and put young weaners on them. There's magnificent feed in these crop stubbles from the summer grasses. So we wean our lambs onto them. Is how we do it, but we don't graze them straight away at that stage. What I developed in about 2010, 11, 12 years ago, was multi-species crops. I was growing crops into grasslands and just a single species of crop, and I wanted to improve the soil even further. And I thought about why we're growing monocultures of crops, even in pasture cropping. So I started to look at multi-species crops. Now this isn't new now. There's a lot of people growing multi-species crops in Australia now. Many of them pasture crop, but a lot are sown conventionally. Magnificent stock feed they are. Far better than a single crop. Anyway, I won't dwell too much on that. So that particular crop there, one before and this one, oats, forage, brassica, vetch, tillage, radish, clover, field pea, turnip. But you can have as many in there as your imagination will let you go to, really. You could get up to 20 if you... So it's all about species diversity. And the whole thing is about species diversity. Not only in a grassland, but in whatever we plant. It should be about species diversity. Mother Nature is very clever and puts a diverse range of plants into everything. Yeah?
By planting this down, what improvement to the soil was there?
Huge improvements to the soil. We did a trial last year on a multi-species crop compared to a single species barley crop. The weight yields on the lambs doubled, but just as important, this is off the top of my head, the carbon levels increased by 20%. Soil structure improved enormously. This is comparing just the two paddocks, both pasture crop. Phosphorus increased by about 50 odd percent, nitrogen by 20 odd percent. Many of them, most of them increase in the multi-species crops. And that's partly because What we've got, if you've got an oat crop or a wheat crop growing, you've got a one-dimensional root system with that crop. If you have 10 species in there, then you've got a three-dimensional root system. You've got everything from tap roots to fibrous roots to all sorts of different things. Plant roots are the main feeders of soil microbes and the root exudates or sugars that are pumped out of them. So you're feeding a far greater range of soil microbes with a diverse range of plants. That's really a very simplified explanation of what's going on. So it's one of the most dramatic things that I've seen in agriculture, and the good thing about it, one of the fastest adoptions I've seen of anything in Australia here. So that's just another photo there as well. Like we've got field peas in there. What the animals do is take a bite of that green stuff, a bite of the old dry grass and mix it. We've got to remember they're ruminants, so they like roughage. They don't do well just on a lush green plant. So I won't dwell on this too much, but it does improve soil enormously. We can add nitrogen with legumes in there as well. Weed control, insect control by having a lot of flowering plants in that mix as well, which attracts beneficial insects. So there's a lot of gains in this. And the reason there's a lot of adoption is that we can get very good animal performance on them. So on top of that, we're harvesting native grass seed before and after the crops. And as I mentioned before, we're getting a long way down the track for human consumption with a lot of our native seeds now.
That'll be a mixture of all those native grasses that you're talking about, isn't it? This grass seed?
Say that again. Sorry. A mix of?
Yeah.
Yeah, it can be, yeah. It's interesting that they will ripen at different times, even though there's a mix in there. You can get close to almost a pure stand, but we do sell mixes of seed for people, which is, for a long time, people wanted one species, and that's only because people have been trained just to buy a bag of lucerne or a bag of clover or something, but really should be buying mixes. Yeah. I mean, better than that, we really don't need to, even though I sell native seed, I talk people out of it. If we manage our properties well, we can restore our grasslands without sowing seed. But that's all I did at home. I didn't sow any native seed at home. I just managed for those grasses. So there was none actually sown at home. So what we can do with it is, like I said before, pasture cropping is being adopted worldwide, but it does restore grassland, restores the farm ecosystem, restores soil ecosystem. We can produce good grain crops and high quality animal fodder, and it's profitable. And the one thing that I didn't put on there, the costs are extremely low and very, very low risk with this. So trials and research, and we need to remember all that the pasture cropping is overlaid by grazing management. The type of grazing management that I touched on there earlier, it's not just something we do on its own. That animals are a vital part of getting all that to work. The property at home was certainly one of the most researched farms in Australia. So CSIRO did work there, Sydney Uni, Canberra here, entomology study done here. Sydney Uni have done quite a lot of different things at home. There's been some work, Land Institute in the USA have done work on pasture cropping, and there's lots of different smaller studies on soil and microbiology and many things been done. The reason why I encourage the research work to be done, because when Cluffy and I developed this stuff early days, we saw really dramatic changes, improvements, and couldn't understand why, and it happened every time. And I said, well, all this stuff happening, no bastard's going to believe this. And why would they? Because it was totally different to anything that we've ever seen before in general agronomy. This isn't supposed to happen. So I actually encourage that research work to protect my own sanity. I've been called a lunatic often enough without all that data to back it up. So what I did on the property, changed grazing management to holistic planned grazing. It changed pasture cropping or the way we sow crops and didn't sow any native grasses. So the results were, and this is since we've been doing this for a lot longer, but I started to monitor from 1999 with transects and many different things. So the grassland increased from 10 species, percentage. The percentage increased from 10% of the paddocks and the property to 80%. So it's a restored native grassland now. And that went from 9 species to 60. And that's what we've monitored. And interestingly, annual weeds decreased from 60% to less than 5%. There's hardly any weeds on the property. Before that, it was just all weeds. When we did the first transect counts, I was shocked because the property was all weeds. And that's not uncommon when you start looking at properties and measuring them carefully. So, we haven't used insecticide for over 25 years on the property. And we don't have insect attack in crops or pastures. You'd wonder how that is possible. Some work that Elise Wendon did from Camp Uni here, she found that there was 600% more insects on property, 600% more insects on the property at home compared to a neighbouring straight through the fence. And it had 125% more diversity in the insects. So, what's actually happened at home, in a practical sense, is that we've got heaps and heaps of spiders now. And interestingly, last year after the drought, harvest native seed, that's just difficult to see, and it was full of lady beetles. All those little yellow dots, all in seed when it was harvested. So the property now is full of predatory wasps, spiders, ladybirds, everything else, everything that eats other insects that do crop damage. So that's why we don't have to use pesticide and use insecticide. And I'd like to add that the more insecticide we use, the more insect damage we'll actually get because we're killing all those predators. Haven't used any fungicide at home either for 25 years. And we don't get crop or pasture damage from fungi damage. Now it works. And the reason why this is just a soil microbiology count. Fungi have increased by 800%. Bacteria increased, not as much, but protozoa and nematodes have increased enormously. That's what's controlling the crop damaging, plant damaging fungi. It's like the same. It's really the same type of thing as insects. The more predators you get, the more control you get on damage. But the property at home isn't organic. It could be, but I like to have plenty of other options. So it's not an organic property. But I found I don't need to use these products. We haven't used fertiliser on pasture for over 42 years since the fire, superphosphate. And we keep on being told, and certainly we were in the past, that if we stop using fertiliser, the world will collapse or something or other. What's actually happened is that nutrients on the farm have actually increased. They have not decreased. So we've been told a whole heap of bullshit and lies about the need for constant need for fertiliser, especially fertiliser like superphosphate. Okay, we can certainly get production if we put fertiliser on, but the fertiliser itself is doing a lot of damage, especially to soil microbiology. So we've reduced crop fertiliser by 70% as well. And the reason why, it is about restoring the whole soil ecosystem, but things like mycorrhizal fungi supply phosphorus, nitrogen, or trace elements, even supply water to plants. Protozoa and nematodes eat insect and bacteria and fungi, which supply nitrogen and other things. And it's also free-living nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soils as well. So there's lots of ways that we get nutrients, and it's all driven by plants. The whole lot is driven by plants. The way to fix our property is to grow more plants and more plant diversity. This is just I'll get through this very quick. The carbon levels have increased by 200% at home. Now the soils hold a lot more water than they did before. All the soil nutrients, including trace elements, have increased by 172% on the property, and that's with careful measurements as well, and that's trace elements as well. pH has increased from 5.2 to over 6. No lime being put on. So in other words, if we get it right, and the only thing that's doing this, nothing I'm doing really, it's plants in the grassland. Restoring the grassland has actually done all that. Oh, sorry, I should have explained that. Yeah, the one on that side, and that's 2 feet or 60 centimetres. That's just through the fence on a neighbouring place there. And we can see from that it's actually built soil right down to 2 feet. We're starting to build soil here. So we can fix it. That's only 100 mils, 4 inches there of topsoil, which the property at home was. That's all the topsoil there was. From when I was a kid ploughing paddocks. That was over about a 10-year period. You don't do this instantly. Mother Nature does it in her own time. But now we can speed this up, and things like multi-species crops and plants and restoring plant diversity will definitely speed that up.
What do you do? This paddock on the left,
Yep.
is multi-species.
Yes, yeah.
There must be paddocks on your place that are just pasture.
It's all pasture and grassland, the whole property now.
What I'm getting at is, do you rotate your program, sowing program?
Oh yes, yes.
Right throughout the place?
That's right. When I plant a crop, I only put it into a paddock for 1 year, then I move on. So I'm about 5 years and I'll get back when I'm growing crops to where I started. And the sheep are rotating as well. And that's part of the key to it. Only do it once and then move on. You could do it more than that. But the reason I do it that way is that I could see such really good improvements. I just wanted to go and fix the next paddock when I first started doing this.
Sorry, the comment that you made about you don't lime anymore because you've got ideal pH. What have you changed in the system that's allowed the pH to remain at an ideal level compared to a typical farm? What's happened?
I normally put up a slide with showing all of the increase in nutrients, which I didn't. I took a few things out, so it didn't take too much time. Now, what are we doing? What's actually happening is, now, we need plants to restore the soil ecosystem and get everything functioning again. We just backtrack a bit. A plant uses sunlight and water basically to grow plants. Only about half or 40% of the sugars that a plant produces in photosynthesis is actually used to grow leaves. The rest of it is pumped into the soil as root exudates or sugars, which you'd think, why would a plant do that? That's just a waste of energy. So there's obviously a very good reason why it's doing it. Hang on. Does anyone know why a plant would pump all those sugars into the soil? Feed microbes, yeah. So obviously microbes are vitally important to plants. So if we have more plants in there, we'll attract a greater range of soil microbes. Now, things like mycorrhizal fungi mycorrhizal fungi also supplies nutrients. There's a couple of simple things that are happening. These plants' roots are going a lot deeper than they used to. They used to be only go about that deep. Now they're going a lot deeper. So they're sourcing minerals from deeper in the soil and cycling them back up. That's a simple way to explain that. The other thing too, which is, I might add, that information has created an academic argument all around the planet. So the question's a good one and it's been posed before. So where are these minerals coming from? It's not alchemy, they've got to come from somewhere. Right. Now, if we backtrack a bit, and I'm aware of the time, if we backtrack a bit, this 4.5 billion years ago, this planet of ours was just a big ball of rock. All the minerals in our soil were here 4.5 billion years ago. Now, microbes evolved, well, plants evolved and microbes evolved, and microbes started breaking down those minerals, and anyway, soil was created with a combination of microbes and plants. So the particles in our soil, the little soil particles, this is granite soil, so there's a lot of soil particles in there, are still hold that original parent material. What we think is happening, this is from soil scientists as well, is that a lot of those minerals are actually coming out of the parent material as well as being cycled. So there's two ways that we think this is happening, because it's well validated. Not only at home, but a lot of the fellows like Tim Wright from up at Armidale, have recorded the similar change with good grazing management. So it definitely happens. Probably didn't answer it exactly, but that's a given. So the place at home now, it sequesters far more carbon than it emits, and that's some new data that we've got recently. We're holding far more water now on farm than we used to. Things like that soil there, I'll explain this. That soil there, every time it rains, will hold 17 millimetres of more rainfall than that one, every time it rains. So you're increasing the water holding capacity of the soil, or a sponge effect. So we start to get buffering against dry seasons. You know, you're eventually in a serious big drought, will still run out of soil moisture, but you certainly have far more available moisture on those edges of those dry seasons. So is it profitable? Remember that $80,000 that I said we used to spend? Well, now we don't need to spend it anymore. So $80,000 ahead before we start every year. And what happened with that, like now annual income is higher, we run more livestock and we get good crop yields. Wool quality is better, and it's better because the feed is more consistent. With the grassland, it's more even feed right throughout the year. We harvest and sell over a tonne of native grass seed a year. Soil carbon levels are increasing, all the soil nutrients are increasing, and on top of this, we don't use, well, the savings are, don't use pesticides and fertilisers and all of those, and we do all that with saving $80,000 and less labour as well. There's not labour count in that. And the reason I haven't put labour in it, if I put labour in it, the figures would look ridiculously high and no one would believe it. So that's the only reason I haven't put labour in it. To sum all this up, really, our farms should function as ecosystems. And it really is that simple. And agriculture can be more profitable, regenerate farms, ecosystems and the planet, because farmers own the majority of the land on this planet, or manage the majority of the land on the planet. We can go a long way towards fixing it. But agricultural to achieve that there, we need agricultural practices need to function close to how Mother Nature designed it in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Will everyone join me in thanking Colin for speaking to us today? Usually I present a limited edition souvenir UMCN mug, which is featured on our flyer, but I forgot to bring them. So hopefully you find this as attractive as some of your little insect friends.
Thank you.
That's for you to take home. Thanks to our friends at Cool Country Natives, everyone's got a little tube stock souvenir to take home today, and they're just out the front on your way out. Thank you very much for your time
Thank you.
today, Colin. And we're going to have some morning tea, and I'm sure Colin will be happy to field some questions
Yep.
because we could talk all day
No,
about
no
this.
problems.
Thank you.
Thank you.